coming today. It's so thrilling to see so many people here for this great presentation. We were thinking about having it outside, but I'm so glad we scheduled it here instead. We're going to have a great presentation today by Marilyn May and Barb Hood. Marilyn May is the former chair of the Bar Historians Committee. Barb Hood is a member emeritus of the Bar Historians Committee. This is a committee that I chair, and we do a lot of really interesting things. Interesting if you're into legal history. So we present the Nora Gwynn Award. We foster and encourage writers of legal history to put articles into the Bar Rag and other publications. We have a long-term, ongoing project of taking oral histories from judges and lawyers as they move into retirement, and we're working with the Alaska Humanities Forum, who's provided us a grant in order to get some of these old oral histories that we have taken over the years, over the decades, into the archives so that they're going to be accessible to the historians of tomorrow. Transcribed, right. And then we also put on CLEs like today's presentation. We, in the past, have put on presentations on judges facing public pressure, on the history of the death penalty in Alaska, on the judiciary article, things like that. And today we are reprising a presentation that was previously given, I think, in Juneau, is that right? A few years ago, to a much more limited audience. And so please help me in welcoming Marilyn and Barb, who are going to be presenting today.
Thank you all. Can you hear okay?
Yes.
Okay. First, I wanted to do a few announcements. Silence your cell phones, please. Be sure to sign in. If you didn't already when you came, there is a sign-up sheet, and if you don't sign in, then they don't know you were here, and you get, you were a no-show. The restrooms are just to the left through this door, and fire exits are both directions. And I want to thank Margaret Newman, who's doing the videography for us today, and Lynn Coffey and Penelope Borland from the Bar Association, who helped set everything up. And then I wanted to just mention that we have a lot to get through today, so Barb and I will be reading a script, and it's not going to be extemporaneous speaking, but that's just because we want to be sure that we hit everything. And anything else you can think of, Barb? Okay, well, here goes. Okay, so it's my privilege to welcome you to this afternoon's CLE, Raising the Bar, Early Women Lawyers in Alaska. Today's program was inspired by the Women in Alaska Law Archive, a project initiated in 1998 by the Joint State-Federal Gender Equality Task Force to honor the 150th anniversary of the women's rights movement. It reprises a presentation that was first given at the 2013 Bar Convention in Juneau to introduce a panel discussion featuring two of Alaska's early women lawyers, Grace Scheibel of Fairbanks and Shirley Coles of Juneau. Sadly, both Scheibel and Coles have died since that time. But while we do not have the benefit of their presence, we do have the benefit of some of their insights, which were captured on tape, and we'll be sharing those with you shortly. Today, we are very honored to have with us Juliana Jan Wilson, who's right up here in the front, a longtime Anchorage lawyer who was sworn into the Alaska Bar Association over 65 years ago in 1959. Of all the women lawyers we will introduce to you today, Ms. Wilson is the only one surviving. Now 96, she continues to live in downtown Anchorage, not far from where she once practiced on 4th Avenue. Please join us in thanking her for being with us today. Nope, I went the wrong direction. Oh, you can use the little slider thing to go back if you need to. We didn't know how to make it go backwards. Women who practiced law in Alaska in the early days of statehood were members of a tiny and select group. In the half-century preceding the early years of statehood, we've been able to document only 15 women members of the Alaska Bar Association. Today, we'd like to introduce you to these women, both to honor their contributions to our profession and to give you a better context for appreciating just how unique and pioneering they truly were. To help set the stage, we'll start with a very brief look back beyond Alaska at some of the early women in the U.S. who appeared before courts of law in their own right. Margaret Brent emigrated from England in the 1600s as an educated woman from a wealthy family. Unmarried, she owned land and businesses and insisted on her rights as an independent gentlewoman of property. In that capacity, she appeared before colonial courts to assert her interests, the first woman known to do so. She was apparently respected for her energy and advocacy, and the governor of Maryland chose her as executor of his will. Today, the American Bar Association's award for women's achievement in the profession bears her name. Yet 100 years after Brent's time, it was still considered very bad form for a woman to seek an active role in public life. In 1776, Abigail Adams would write to her husband, future U.S. President John Adams, urging him as follows: "In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." Her husband politely rebuffed her request as threatening despotism of the petticoat. Indeed, the U.S. Constitution did little to protect women's rights. Though permitted to vote in many colonies during the colonial period, women were systematically disenfranchised by new state legislatures beginning in 1777. This campaign to take away women's right to vote likely inspired what has been called the first wave of feminism, heralded by Englishwoman Mary Wollstonecraft's book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, published in 1792. Yet despite the growing rumblings of frustration, a woman speaking in public remained a matter of outrage and scandal. Maria Miller Stewart, an African-American woman, was one of the first women in the U.S. to become a professional orator. Active in the free black community of Boston, she wrote essays on abolition for William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper and delivered 4 eloquent speeches between 1732 and 33. But she gave up her career after only a year, returning to teaching because of the intense backlash she received for stepping out of a woman's traditional role. Female activists in the movement to abolish slavery, like the sisters Angelina and Sarah Grimke, also called for a greater role for women in public life. It was when early abolitionist women were excluded from the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London and later failed to gain the support for women's rights even from prominent African American men like Frederick Douglass that they determined to organize.
In 1848, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized a convention advocating for women's rights in Seneca Falls, New York, which was attended by several hundred women and men. Delegates adopted a declaration of sentiments that spelled out the many ways that men and men's laws were depriving women of their rightful place as citizens. These included the following grievances relevant to women in the law. Quote, "He has monopolized nearly all the profitable employments, and from those she is permitted to follow, she receives but a scanty remuneration. He closes against her all the avenues to wealth and distinction, which he considers most honorable to himself. As a teacher of theology, medicine, or law, she is not known. And he has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed against her." The Seneca Falls Convention signaled the birth of the modern women's rights movement in America, but it would be slow going. 20 years later, in the wake of the Civil War, Congress failed to include specific protection for women's rights in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Frustrated and increasingly impatient, activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony launched the National Women's Suffrage Association and began a concerted campaign to secure the right to vote for women. The struggle would take another 50 years until the adoption of the 19th Amendment in 1920. It was in the late 1800s that women began seeking actively to enter the legal profession on a variety of fronts. In 1869, Belle Mansfield became the first woman attorney to join a licensed bar after passing the Iowa bar exam. That same year, Lema Barkalow became the first woman law student entering the law department of Washington University. She would take and pass the Missouri bar in 1870. In 1872, Charlotte Ray became the first woman admitted to the DC bar and the first African American woman to join any formal bar in the U.S. But not all jurisdictions allowed women, and in 1873, the U.S. Supreme Court held in Bradville versus Illinois that states could statutorily deny women the right to practice law. Probably no aspiring woman lawyer exemplified the struggle to enter the profession more dramatically than Belva Lockwood. In 1871, she completed her studies for a law degree at National University Law School, but the faculty refused her degree. She appealed, her degree was ultimately granted, and she was admitted to the D.C. bar. But when she tried to practice, the U.S. Court of Claims refused to admit her, ruling it is not for the judiciary to intermeddle with the question as to what is or what is not the proper sphere of woman. It is enough for judges to know that her legal position is by an unwritten law interwoven with the very fabric of society, and that when society frames constitutions of government, it places them upon a foundation of its own immemorial usages. The position which this court assumes is that under the Constitution and laws of the United States, a court is without power to grant such an application for admission to the bar, and that a woman is without legal capacity to take the office of attorney. Lockwood lobbied Congress for over 6 years, ultimately gaining admission to the practice before the Supreme Court in 1879. She would have an illustrious career in politics and law thereafter, until retiring at the age of 83. In a similar vein, Lavinia Goodell was denied admission to the Wisconsin bar in 1875. But in her case, the court was more concerned with her sensibilities than her traditional stature. The court reasoned, it would be revolting to all female sense of the innocence and sanctity of their sex, shocking to men's reverence for womanhood and faith in women, on which hinge all the better affections and humanities of life, that women should be permitted to mix professionally in all the nastiness of the world which finds its way into the courts of justice. All the vices and all the infirmities of all society with which the profession has to deal, and which goes towards filling judicial reports which must be read for accurate knowledge of the law, reverence for all womanhood would suffer in the public spectacle of women so instructed and so engaged. By the late 1800s, persistence was beginning to pay off. State bar associations around the country began admitting women, such as the Supreme Court of Indiana here in 1893. It was against this backdrop that the first women lawyers ventured to Alaska.
In Alaska, in the early days of the territory, there were few lawyers at all. A 1901 roster lists 46 members of the Alaska Bar Association, mostly in Southeast, Nome, and Valdez. Fairbanks and Anchorage did not yet exist, but things were changing quickly. When gold was discovered near Fairbanks in 1902, a tent city and frontier town soon emerged, and two of the first women admitted to the Alaska Bar Association would soon arrive. Judge James Wickersham moved the seat of the 3rd Judicial District from Eagle and dedicated this new courthouse on the banks of the Chena River on July 4, 1904. Nathalina Roberts Moore entered this scene about 1 year later. Born in Massachusetts in 1875, Natalie, as she was known, had moved west to Tacoma as a child. She studied law with attorneys at a Washington law firm and passed the Washington bar exam in 1899. After several years of practice, including a stint as chief clerk for the Northern Pacific Railway, she was admitted to the Washington bar in 1903. What brought Natalie to Fairbanks is unknown, but she soon found work as a stenographer in a private law firm. Fairbanks had grown quickly to a community of 5,000 and boasted a school, hospital, and several churches, along with other less savory attractions like 24-hour saloons, gambling parlors, and an infamous red light district. Soon, Natalie married a local dentist, Charles Merton Moore, who in 1906 gained unwelcome renown when a candle in his office spread flames to his curtains, causing a fire that leveled several blocks of the downtown, including Judge Wickersham's new courthouse. Apparently not one to hold a grudge, Wickersham later recommended Moore for admission to the Alaska Bar by reciprocity. She was sworn in May 1908, almost 110 years ago. 4 years ago, in our listing of early women lawyers, we skipped this next woman entirely. The Alaska Bar Association's membership records go only back to 1927, so we have no definitive record of attorneys sworn in before then and must rely on other historical sources. In her new book, The Biggest Damned Hat, Tales from Alaska's Territorial Lawyers and Judges, Pam Kravis, right here, waving, introduces us to Isabel Gambler Gilman, a British woman who came to the U.S. in 1888, attended law school at Lincoln Jefferson University, and was admitted to the Washington State Bar in 1909. According to research by longtime Juneau historian R.N. DeArmond, Gilman was admitted to the Alaska Bar in 1910 and lived here for a decade. DeArmond credits Gilman with winning a significant Southeast fishing case during this time as a lawyer, but she apparently also worked as a school principal and teacher and continued to write for publication. A biographical sketch that appeared in the Granite Monthly, a New Hampshire literary magazine, in 1916 describes Gilman's time here as follows. Over the vast and scarcely peopled empire of the North, she has been led by her tireless and adventurous spirit, yet rendering valiant service all the while. Entering the government school service, she was for 2 years principal of the White Graded School at Petersburg, since when she has been stationed at Kanakawak on the Bering Sea coast, at Seldovia and Cook Inlet, and at Rampart in the interior, just under the Arctic Circle in the Alaska School Service, the northernmost point on the continent where a school is maintained. Gilman authored at least 2 books about her time in Alaska, including Alaska Land, A Curious Contradiction in 1914, and Alaska, the American Northland in 1923. One reviewer noted that Alaska Land gives most interesting glimpses of that faraway wonderland and not a little insight into the character of this remarkable woman. Gilman left Alaska in 1920 to move to New York, where she continued to write and publish until her death in 1949. The territory's 3rd woman attorney was a contemporary of Natalie Moore's in early Fairbanks, but she came to Alaska as a doctor and an accomplished singer, not as a lawyer. Aileen Chanot Baskerville Bradley Beegler was born in Paris in 1867 and trained in music. But after her family emigrated to the U.S., she married a physician, Thomas Baskerville, and decided to pursue a medical career. Most American medical schools did not admit women at the time, so she enrolled in the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. She graduated in 1903 and practiced for several years near Pittsburgh. In 1907, she and her husband moved to Fairbanks, hoping the climate would improve his asthma. Yet Dr. Baskerville died soon afterward, and she married James Freeman Bradley, a Canadian miner. Here, in a photo from the book A Place of Belonging by Fairbanks historian Phyllis Mobius, Dr. Bradley stands in front of her clinic in downtown Fairbanks. And there's that book. Almost immediately, Aileen became involved in the local music and theater scene. Here, she performs in a Fairbanks operetta in 1909, her trained soprano voice having quickly made her a star. In addition to her roles as physician and musical celebrity, Aileen was intensely involved in civic affairs. E.T. Barnett, the founder of Fairbanks, was suspected of corruption and fraud in the closure of a local bank. Aileen helped spearhead an investigation, calling on officials to take action after a grand jury of Barnett's friends and associates failed to indict him. Barnett was ultimately arrested and charged with 11 counts, including embezzlement, making false reports, and perjury. But his trial ended with an acquittal on all but 1 count and a mere fine of $1,000. One local newspaper called it the rottenest judicial farce the North has ever witnessed. Not to be deterred, Aileen continued to protest and advocate for reform, helping organize a bonfire on the Chena River where bank officials were burned in effigy, along with a figure labeled Justice. Hundreds of Fairbanksans attended to express their outrage, and in response, the first territorial legislature passed the Territorial Banking Act of 1913. Later, Aileen became active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, helping to secure a 2-to-1 vote in support of bone-dry law prohibiting alcohol in 1916. These experiences gave Aileen a taste for the law that she began to pursue in earnest. She studied under the former law partner to Judge James Wickersham and passed the bar exam in 1917. Ironically, one of her bar examiners was a bank official she had helped burn in effigy just a few years before. For reasons related to her citizenship status, which is a separate story in itself, Aileen was not sworn in until 1920. She then served for a time as a city magistrate and legal advisor to the city. With the death of her second husband in 1918, Aileen again remarried, this time to Michael Beegler, a miner from Livengood. Soon they became snowbirds, spending winters in Southern California. In 1930, they left Fairbanks for the last time, heading south on a steamer. Aileen died there in 1947 at age 75. The daughter of a family friend later remembered Aileen this way: "Daddy admired her. Mother obeyed her. We all loved her."
Only one woman attorney would join the Alaska Bar in the 25 years after Aileen Biegler's admission, and she would be admitted in Juneau. Mildred Robinson Herman was born in Indiana in 1891 and came to Alaska in 1919, settling in Juneau. She was married to the local pharmacist, mother of 2 teenage boys, and working as a high school English teacher when she became a lawyer, in her words, by accident in midlife. During the 20s, she served as chair of the Legislative Committee of the Alaska Federation of Women's Clubs, which gave her a very public role advocating on behalf of women and children. After seeing important legislation thwarted time and again by, quote, "a large group of lawyer lobbyists who at that session and every other session of the Alaska legislature controlled legislation in the territory," she decided to take action. Inspired at last by her frustration with the territorial legislature's failure to pass a community property law for which the women's group had actively campaigned, Herman announced that she would study for the bar. In those days, one could become a lawyer by studying law with a practicing attorney, then taking the bar exam. But the territorial legislature, well familiar with Herman and her influence, acted quickly to make it more difficult, requiring either a law degree, not available in Alaska, or 2 years of experience at a law office. Eventually, Herman completed law studies by correspondence through LaSalle Extension University. According to early Juneau attorney, legislator, and judge Tom Stewart, who was childhood friends with Herman's sons, some gentlemen of the bar were then reluctant to admit Herman. Some local bar leaders cast aspersions on her correspondence course and questioned her credentials. And bar examiners made her take the exam more than once, apparently unusual in those days. But she ultimately prevailed in breaking into what she had once viewed as, quote, "a man's field in a man's country." Herman was in her early 40s when she was finally admitted to the Alaska Bar Association in Juneau in 1934, and soon gained a reputation as a skilled trial attorney with a sharp intellect and keen sense of humor. A 1940 article about Herman in the National Women's Law Journal is described as follows by author Pam Kravitz. In the article, Herman is lighthearted, positive, and smart. She never takes herself too seriously and deflects any sense of grand ambition. This ability to focus on the positive and move past early setbacks from certain male colleagues no doubt contributed to her success. During World War II, Herman served as director of the Alaska Office of Price Administration based in Juneau. In the 1950s, she became a key leader in the push for statehood, serving as secretary of the Alaska Statehood Committee and as a delegate to Alaska's Constitutional Convention in 1955-56. At the Constitutional Convention, she served on the executive committee with such luminaries as William Egan, Tom Stewart, Katie Hurley, and Frank Peratrovich. She also held key positions on key committees, including rules and style and drafting. By the reports of many who knew her, Herman was a powerful advocate and a formidable adversary. The list of civic organizations to which she gave her time and talent is long and includes the National Association of Women Lawyers and the National Federation of Press Women. Clearly, Herman was a believer in working together for the advancement of women's rights. It would be more than a decade before other women were admitted to the Alaska Bar, and World War II would bring them here. Dorothy Tyner was born and raised in a small town in Kansas. She left home for Topeka, where she received her undergraduate and law degrees from what is now Washburn University. After graduating in 1941, she served as law librarian and taught at the law school while also working for an accounting firm. She left teaching in 1943 to work for the War Labor Board in Kansas City at the height of World War II. After being refused a promotion by a male superior because she was a woman, an event she would later describe as discrimination I'll never forget, she transferred to the Office of Price Administration, which brought her to Alaska in 1944. She served as assistant enforcement attorney under the supervision of Mildred Herman and spent time overseeing investigations in Juneau, Fairbanks, Cordova, and Anchorage. Tyner was admitted to the Alaska Bar Association in Anchorage in 1946, joining the august Anchorage Bar Association, pictured here outside of 4th Avenue Bar after one of the regular meetings. She described her first bar meeting as quite an experience. Quote, "There were 12 of them," she said, "and they put 3 bottles on the table. One was Scotch, one was bourbon, and one was something else. After the war, Tyner entered private practice, first in Anchorage and later in Seward. She found her fellow attorneys helpful and supportive. They would call me up and give me a case, she said. Then they'd call me up and tell me how to handle it. They were just great, really. I had no problems with the lawyers, with the press, or anybody. I didn't feel oppressed. I felt real good. Although money was tight for everyone after the war, Tyner maintained a general practice of criminal and civil cases, or in her words, just anything that walked in. Soon she married and had a baby, but kept practicing. That was my life, she said. I loved it. I loved the courtroom. And Tyner apparently wasn't turned off by the Anchorage bar's wild ways. When the whole group was delayed for several hours on a scheduled flight to Nome, she said, everybody had a hip flask in their pockets, so we were half plastered before we got on the plane. I remember a colleague saying, I don't know why we took an airplane, we're flying already. After 15 years in private practice, Tyner joined the public sector. From 1961 to 68, she worked as a law clerk for the U.S. District Court judges Walter Hodge and Raymond Plummer. Then she made history as one of the first women judges in our state when Governor Walter Hickel appointed her to the District Court in Anchorage in 1968. She would serve on the bench for 8.5 years until her retirement in 1977. I loved it for a while, she said of her time on the bench. There were many rewarding experiences helping people, just doing what you thought was best. But over time, she confessed to feeling burnout from the pace of the job and apparently missed the legal gatherings and camaraderie. You know, she said, a judge has to be a little bit reclusive, which I didn't particularly like. In 2008, Tyner was honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award by her alma mater, Washburn School of Law in Topeka. She was recognized as the first full-time woman law professor at the school and one of the few in the nation at that time. Yet despite her role as a pioneering woman lawyer and judge, Tyner offered a surprising objection to women lawyers groups in her 1982 oral history interview with Pam Kravitz. She recalled attending an ABA cocktail party in Chicago before moving to Alaska when the subject of forming a Women Lawyers Association came up. I said no over my dead body. We're lawyers. If you're a lawyer, you don't have to forget you're a woman. But when you're a lawyer, you're a lawyer. That's it. And lawyers' problems are lawyers' problems. My problems are the same as a man's problems in the law. But then interestingly, when asked whether she had problems as a woman that a man wouldn't have, she replied, not in Alaska, really, except for the fact that I didn't get some business. I found very little discrimination because I was a woman, really very little. But people didn't come to me for major things because I was a woman. I'm sure of that.
Dorothy Oz Holland attended the State University of Iowa at a time when the respectable career options for women were limited. You were going to be a secretary, a teacher, or a nurse, she once said. That irritated the life out of me. So I made up my mind that I was going to pick something I wanted to do, whether everybody else thought it made sense or not. When she picked law, her father thought she was crazy. Holland received her law degree in 1942 from the University of Iowa Law School and came north in 1944 to work with the Office of Price Administration. After the war, she served briefly as a U.S. Commissioner for Cordova, then moved to Anchorage in 1948 to clerk for U.S. District Court Judge Anthony Diamond, a man she greatly admired. In 1955, she served as a delegate to Alaska's Constitutional Convention, and from 1957 to 59, she served in the last territorial legislature. During the 60s and 70s, she worked for the Alaska Attorney General, serving for a time as chief of the Anchorage office. Despite her distinguished legal career, Holland is perhaps best remembered as a staunch advocate for passage of the National Equal Rights Amendment and founder of the National Organization for Women in Alaska. I have been a feminist as long as I can remember, she reflected in a 1982 interview, probably with Pam Kravitz. And it was a really lonely world out there. I almost felt as if there was something wrong with me because other women didn't seem bothered by these things. With the growth of the women's rights movement in the 1960s, she found she wasn't alone in the world. In her oral history interview with Pam Kravitz in 1982, Holland offered the following perspective on women in the territory. I'm sure independent thinking women were attracted to Alaska, especially in territorial days. While they didn't recognize themselves by that name, they behaved as feminists and thought like feminists. It's interesting that the only two women sworn into the Alaska Bar during the decade of the 1940s would hold such differing views on organizing for women's rights. Dorothy Tyner would form a women's group only over her dead body. Dorothy Holland devoted her later life to the women's rights movement. Fortunately, the legal profession became a little less lonely for women in the years leading up to statehood. Juliana Jan Wilson attended law school with her husband Stan and graduated in 1950 from the University of North Carolina. She was admitted to the Alaska Bar in 1951 and went to work for Anchorage attorney J.L. McCary Jr., with whom she's pictured here. When McCary was later appointed to the U.S. District Court, Wilson purchased his law practice, handling mostly real estate, probate, and corporate cases. Wilson's husband soon joined her in the firm of Wilson and Wilson, which was located on 4th Avenue above a bar and restaurant. This office was destroyed in the 1964 earthquake, but the firm relocated and remained in business until 1980 when the Wilsons semi-retired. A 1968 article in the Anchorage Times entitled "Women Make Crack Lawyers, Say Two Who Are," includes observations about Wilson as the, quote, trim blonde mother of two who, quote, dresses conservatively and is partial to knit suits. And it explains that Wilson is able to fulfill her wifely duties with the help of a full-time housekeeper. But it also conveys clearly that law can be a rewarding career choice for women. In law, Wilson is quoted, you come into contact with every imaginable type of person. That's what makes it so interesting. It's a good feeling to know you've helped people who may desperately need it. Today, Wilson is one of the very few lawyers alive who practiced when Alaska was still a territory. Here she poses with 5 of her colleagues from the territorial era at the 2015 Territorial Lawyers Dinner here in Anchorage. And it should be noted that in addition to being an early woman lawyer, she holds the distinction of being a pioneering woman in the military, serving in the Navy waves during World War II, pictured here with Senator Lisa Murkowski as she embarked on a recent honor flight to Washington, D.C. Thank you, Jan Wilson, for the people you've helped and the example you've set for all of us. Gladys Stabler Wind was born in Washington in 1906, the daughter of a wheat farmer. She graduated from the University of Oregon with degrees in education and mathematics in 1928 and was offered a job teaching math at Juneau High School. Soon she married Howard Stabler, who was the U.S. Attorney for the First District. She had to resign her teaching position when she married on the theory that jobs were scarce and no family should have two. But when her husband opened a law practice in 1933, she started helping out. In those days, you could take the bar exam without a law degree if you studied for 3 years under a lawyer's guidance. It took 8 years, but Wind eventually passed the exam and was admitted to the bar in 1951, becoming her husband's law partner. I was an office lawyer, she would later share, with a focus on probate work. The firm Stabler and Stabler continued until her husband's death in 1963, when she joined the new firm of Stabler, Gregg, and Mavison. In 1968, Wind married an old college friend and they retired to Oregon. When Judge Patricia Collins caught up with Wind in 1998 seeking contributions to the Women in Law Archive, she would recount, "Studying law and becoming a lawyer changed me. I became more focused and self-disciplined. I never found it a disadvantage to be a woman. I loved my work. It was much more rewarding than playing bridge." The 9th woman lawyer we can document, Kay Ritchie, chose the legal profession in part to avoid routine and to feed her love of travel. "I detest routine," she told the reporter for this Anchorage Times article in 1968. "Most lawyers settle in one jurisdiction," she continued, "but I've used my profession to travel like mad." Admitted to the Alaska Bar in 1953, Ritchie had already practiced in 5 states when this article was written, and had handled a variety of cases from criminal matters to business law. We haven't discovered much else about her, though. It's apparent she practiced in Alaska for some time, so if any of you have any recollections or more information, we would welcome it. Mary Alice Miller was born in Chicago and moved to Missouri as a child, where she attended the University of Missouri and received her law degree in 1944. We need to give a shout out to civics education for her choice of career. She decided on law in high school after her high school civics class sat on a Missouri lands trial. "I was absolutely fascinated," she would later recall. After practicing for several years in Colorado, Miller came to Alaska in 1955 when her husband was transferred to Eielson Air Force Base. She worked as a secretary for the Fairbanks law firm Collins and Clasby until her admission to the Alaska Bar in 1956, when she became an associate for the firm. Miller remained with Collins and Clasby until December 1967, when she was appointed to the Fairbanks District Court, becoming one of the first women judges in our state. Judge Miller retired in 1980 after 13 years on the bench. "You wish you could straighten out the world," she said at the time, and of course you can't. But she did have hopes for the judiciary itself. There are no women on the Superior Court bench and no justices, no woman on the Judicial Council. There's a good chance that will change soon. Our 11th woman lawyer, Jane Asher, earned her law degree from Tulane School of Law in Louisiana and was admitted to the Alaska Bar in Juneau in 1959. She served as a law clerk to U.S. Territorial Judge Raymond Kelly, an attorney for the Veterans Affairs Commission, and an assistant attorney general before joining the staff of the Legislative Council in 1960 as revisor of statutes. Her articles and updates appeared regularly in the Alaska Law Journal in the early 1960s, advising lawyers and legislatures about changes to the way state laws were organized. In January 1963, she announced the publication, after years of planning and work, of a new 5-volume set of laws. They were called the Alaska Statutes.
M. Ashley Dickerson, Alaska's 12th woman attorney, was born and raised in Alabama and was a childhood friend of Rosa Parks. She earned a law degree from Howard University in 1948 and became the first African-American woman admitted to the Alabama Bar Association. When she opened her first practice there were only 3 other women lawyers in that state. In a later interview, Dickerson observed that there were some advantages to being an outsider. Sometimes folks would call and say, "I know I can trust you because I know you won't be having cocktails with the other attorney tonight or coffee in the morning." Yet ironically, she had trouble at first drawing clients from the black community. She said, "I had very few black clients at first because black people thought there was something magic about a white attorney. I started getting black clients only after I started winning cases against some of their white attorneys." After 10 years practicing in Alabama, Dickerson moved to Alaska in 1958 with her 3 teenage sons and filed for a homestead near Wasilla. In 1959, she became the first African American of either gender admitted to the Alaska Bar Association. Dickerson couldn't find a job when she first got to town, but would later confess that because of her independence and free spirit, she couldn't have worked for anybody anyway. She also faced discrimination in finding housing. At the time she moved to Anchorage, homes in many neighborhoods contained covenants against selling to people of color. Undaunted, Dickerson soon purchased an office building in Fairview, one of the few neighborhoods where African Americans were permitted to live. She set up her own law practice there, living weekdays in the back of her office and weekends on her Wasilla homestead. An active member of the Anchorage legal community for nearly 50 years, Dickerson focused on civil cases, particularly those that raised her passion for equality and civil rights. She remembers male judges in the early days criticizing legal protections against gender discrimination, with one even calling them bad law and suggesting that women were better off the way they were before. But she made some memorable waves of her own. According to local legend, it was Dickerson who was once sent home by a judge who objected to her appearing before him in pants. She changed and came back in a ball gown, complete with tiara. By the way, we don't know the veracity of that story, but it seems to fit and we're sticking with it. Dickerson received many awards during her law career, including the prestigious Margaret Brent Award from the ABA's Commission on Women in the Profession. Anchorage District Court Judge Pamela Washington, Alaska's first African-American woman judge, considered Dickerson one of her mentors. Quote, "She basically had to break through all kinds of barricades just so I could be here today," Washington once said. Yet despite her own experiences, Dickerson's concern for our justice system went beyond issues of race and gender. When once asked whether she had any words of wisdom for lawyers today, she responded, quote, "Speed up the justice system. It's too slow. And make it less expensive. People are afraid to seek justice." So it's no surprise that her memoir, published when she was in her late 80s, is entitled Delayed Justice for Sale. And today, Stephanie Whitethorn, if you want to raise your hand, Stephanie has a supply of these and they are available still, so see her if you're interested. It's a great memoir. Which brings us to the end of the territory and to the advent of statehood. Grace Burke Scheibel was born in Tacoma, Washington in 1925 and moved to Juneau as an infant. She graduated from high school in Juneau in 1943 and was invited by Charles Bunnell, the University of Alaska's founding president, to attend college in Fairbanks. She earned a bachelor's degree in history and political science there in 1949, followed by a master's in history at George Washington University in 1955, and a law degree from Yale Law School in 1959. In February 1960, she became the first attorney admitted to the Alaska Bar after statehood. In this photo, she is sworn in by Superior Court Judge Harry Aaron in Fairbanks. Scheibel practiced with the same Fairbanks firm for the next 27 years, becoming a named partner in 1966 in Murdy's, Scheibel, Staley, and Delisio, now Cook, Schumann, and Grosclose. During this time, she served nearly a decade as counsel for Arctic Slope Regional Corporation and traveled often to communities on Alaska's North Slope. In 1987, she accepted the invitation of Governor Steve Cooper to serve as Alaska's Attorney General, becoming the first Attorney General in Alaska, women Attorney General in Alaska, and one of the first in the country. She would hold the position for 2 years. A decade later, she would be honored with fellow women lawyers for this and other achievements at the 1999 Women in Law Luncheon, sponsored by the Alaska Joint State-Federal Gender Equality Task Force. Here she is with Jan Wilson, M. Ashley Dickerson, and another notable early woman attorney, Esther Wanneke. Throughout her career, Scheibel played a leadership role in numerous organizations and institutions, both public and private. She chaired the Alaska Permanent Fund and the University of Alaska Board of Trustees, and served on the board of the Nature Conservancy. Her many awards included an honorary doctorate of laws from UAF, the William Egan Outstanding Alaskan Award from the Alaska Chamber of Commerce, Philanthropist of the Year from the Alaska chapter of the National Society of Fundraising Executives, and a University of Alaska President's Medal for Excellence for her decades of support for the University of Alaska. Grace Scheibel died in Fairbanks earlier this year at the age of 91 after a long and remarkable life.
The next woman lawyer after statehood was Helen Lucille Davis Simpson, who was admitted in 1961. Simpson was born in Oregon in 1919. She graduated high school with honors in 1937, then was awarded an undergraduate degree magna cum laude from Willamette University in Salem, Oregon. After earning 2 master's degrees at the University of Oregon and Gallaudet College in Washington, D.C., she moved to Alaska in 1956. She initially taught English at Anchorage High School, but soon focused again on graduate school, earning her law degree from Willamette School of Law in 1960. She returned to Alaska and was admitted to the Alaska Bar Association in 1961. She opened her private practice the same year, which she continued for 41 years until her retirement in 2002. Her practice focused on civil cases with an emphasis on family law. As late as 1998, she was arguing and winning family cases before the Alaska Supreme Court. In his recent memoir, Courtroom, Cartridges, and Campfires, Lawyering on the Last Frontier, longtime Anchorage attorney Wayne Anthony Ross credited Simpson with giving him a foot in the door when he first arrived in Anchorage in 1968. I immediately began to look for a job, he wrote, and I did some contract work for an elderly, to me at least, attorney named Helen Simpson. I think she paid me $20 per hour, which I was glad to get. In those days, there were only about 7 women attorneys in Anchorage. Women attorneys were rare. Helen Simpson and I stayed friends until the day she died. Simpson passed away in 2005 in Anchorage at age 85. And finally, Shirley M. Coles was admitted in Juneau in 1962. She was born and raised in Chaska, Minnesota, where she apparently learned to play the guitar, according to this wonderful photo I'm flipping. She came to Alaska at age 19 to work for the Civil Aeronautics Administration. After 11 years with the agency, she left the state in 1956 to study political science and law at the University of Colorado. 5 years later, she returned, passed the bar, and served a clerkship with Justice John Diamond of Juneau, one of the original justices on the Alaska Supreme Court. Throughout this time, she was an avid skier and outdoors woman, as evidenced in this 1952 photo with the Juneau Ski Club. She was also great friends with lawyers like early luminary Tom Stewart, who is pictured here with Shirley and others at a 1954 beach picnic. After her admission to the bar, Coles was in private practice in Juneau for many years, first with the small firm of Stabler, Gregg, and Mavison, which was her maiden name, and later as a sole practitioner. Here she's pictured in a 1963 photo of the Juneau Bar Association. On the occasion of a reception in her honor in 2001, then Justice Bud Carbonetti stated, "She embodies all the virtues that come to mind when people talk of the good old days. Common sense, hard work, a helping hand to anyone in need, quiet competence, a strong sense of the common good." Cole served terms as president of the Juneau Bar Association and the Juneau Concert Association, and volunteered her time and expertise to a number of other legal and civic groups over the years. She was also a two-time champion of the annual poker tournament at the Alaska Bar Convention. And I just, before the program, heard a story about Shirley Coles from one of our bar people here, Lynn Coffey, who said that it is due to Shirley Coles that she is who she is because Shirley arranged for her adoption. In 2002, Shirley received her 50-year pin from the Alaska Bar Association. She died at age 88, just 3 months after our 2013 CLE in Juneau.
Although Scheibel and Coles are no longer with us, we'd like to take a moment to share a few of their remarks with you from their 2013 presentation at the Bar Convention. All was well. First, they were asked what led them to pursue a career in law.
So, Shirley, why did you particularly want to become an attorney?
Well, I was with the Civil Aeronautics Administration as a radio operator for 11 years, and I had the funds to go to college, which I'd always wanted to do and hadn't done. But I had two friends who were lawyers who all of you know, Tom Stewart, Dick Regan. Both were bright, involved, and concerned about other people, and both encouraged me at my old age to try law school after doing basic college. And I just jumped into it. It was a great step. Loved it.
Great.
Well, mine was sort of roundabout. I was the analyst for the Legislative Council in territorial days. And my being a legislative analyst meant basically doing research on topics that the Legislative Council had decided were important. So I was doing this. Along comes the 1955 session, and I had the only desk in the whole territorial offices that had a key and that had a lock. And so I was taking care of the budget bill for the chairman of the House Ways and Means. And he kept saying, you know, you've got to start writing laws. You know, it's really important that legislative analysts understand how to prepare legislation. And I said, I really don't want to do it. And they assigned me the first bill to be introduced in the 1955 session, which was to name the territorial bird.
After the mosquito, what did you do?
Well, you know, they said just look at how we introduced the territorial something or the other. And so I did, and I wrote that bill, and I said, that's it. I'm not writing another piece of legislation because I don't know what I'm doing. And as a result of that, I decided I'll go to law school and I'll come back and I'll run this agency.
Great. Well, and as you all know, one time, so Shirley?
Next, they were asked whether being a woman in a predominantly male profession was ever a hardship for them, and whether they ever felt discriminated against because of their gender. Again, we'll see if we can find their words.
Well, it was not an issue for me. I just felt lucky that I, you know, was an Alaskan rather than somebody from another state. Because Alaskans, I think traditionally, have been very accepting of women in any kind of position. They just, I just have never faced any kind of discrimination because I was a woman attorney. And I think that Alaska is just a good place to be able to practice law.
Yeah, I was never had any problems except once. When I first came back from school, I wanted to work for the AG's office, and there were like 6 people in that office at that time. Anyway, the AG didn't want women, and he would not give me a job. So I went to work for Jack Doyle in legislative affairs for about 6 months, and then, believe it or not, Justice Diamond came downstairs to solicit me to come to work for him as his law clerk because his new clerk's wife didn't like Alaska. And you know, it's one of those stories that you're just lucky. I was just lucky to go with John Diamond for 1.5 years, and I learned a lot from him.
Well, it was not an issue for me. I just felt lucky that I, was an Alaskan rather than somebody from another state. Because Alaskans, I think, traditionally have been very accepting of women in any kind of position. They just, I just have never faced any kind of discrimination.
Okay, and finally, they offered reflections on their careers and their advice to others.
Well, the practice of law can be a bore or it can be great fun. I think that I found practicing law was great fun. I think I was a pretty good lawyer, but I really, really felt that it wasn't a profession that required you to be down on the mouth and really kind of brutal. Law can be a very satisfying way to make a living.
Earlier in the program, Grace, you mentioned that you were very pleased with the Alaska Bar Association, and I have to share with you, the last few days has been my first detailed experience with the Alaska Bar Association, and I have to say I'm impressed. I'm impressed with the people I've interacted with and impressed with the quality of the issues and programs that the Alaska Bar is dealing with. Shirley, you have any final comments for us?
Only that I have had 50 years of great life with the Alaska Bar Association and with the practice of law. I've enjoyed it tremendously. I enjoyed working with the lawyers that I worked with. I didn't do a lot of contested cases. My practice was more paperwork practice, and it was very satisfying to me, and I loved the people I worked with and around the court system that you get involved with in many phases. And I must mention again, for the 10th time that he got mentioned this weekend, Judge Carbonetti, who is always kindly and good and helpful whenever he could be. I didn't have many dealings along that level, but just socially, all of these folks were good. And I think the young people just have to jump in there and do it. If you feel like a solo practice, do it. If you feel like you want to work for the government, do it. A lot of folks nowadays, I guess, work for the government as lawyers, but not doing a lot of legal work. They do other work too, and that's good. So you just have to kind of feel your way, I guess.
Grace?
Sorry about that. We would like to close with a small hint of how things have changed. Only 14 women entered the legal profession in the decade that Grace Scheibel and Shirley Coles began their careers, representing fewer than 5% of Alaska's attorneys. Today, 1,595 women are members of the Alaska Bar Association, nearly 36%. I'm sure I'm not the only woman here who attributes at least some of this remarkable progress to the vision, competence, tenacity, and grit of the early women lawyers and the example they set. And with that, we'd like to conclude the program, but I'd also like to invite all of you who may have stories or may have your own stories to tell, or photos or documents or anything that might help us understand and record and preserve the history of the bar and women in the bar, to notify any of us, notify Michael. We're very interested. We keep an archive, and the stories we have are basically stories people have found the time to protect and to give to us. It doesn't automatically happen that these have been preserved. Particularly oral histories. If you're willing to take oral histories, or if you have them, or even do your own, we would welcome that. Also, for those of you who've been in the bar, we would really appreciate your help. In 1998, we started an archive, and we tried to identify the first women lawyers in a variety of capacities around the state. It's been added to a little bit over the year, but if you would be interested in looking at it, there are a number of people listed, and if you can add to it or correct us, please do so. By the way, when we first started this project, Mildred Herman was the first woman attorney in Alaska, and by making mistakes year after year, we've identified 3 other people just by people bringing that to our attention. So that's how history happens. It gets preserved, I guess. Also, just to remind you, Pam Kravis is here. Her book is available not today, but she can give you the information on how to obtain it. And we want to congratulate her on the book. It's a really great read, and there are several chapters that focus on women in the law. And finally, just again, thank you all for coming. Thanks for sharing this hour with us. And we'll see you next time at the next Bar Historians event. Appreciate it.